On January 17, 2023, I was confronted with what I believed to be an insurmountable surgical challenge in my professional life. This perception arose because the discovery within that patient's skull defied every neurosurgical principle I had assimilated throughout my 18-year career. I am Dr. Catherine Mills, and until my resignation last month, I served as the senior neurosurgeon at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, Tennessee. Over nearly 2 decades of performing brain surgery, I had convinced myself that I had witnessed every conceivable variation of trauma, tumor, and neurological disaster the human brain could endure. My conviction, however, was mistaken. The medical case that ultimately led to my resignation originated from a construction accident in downtown Nashville. A 35-year-old man, David Holloway, was struck on the head by a falling steel beam. The impact should have been instantly fatal. Instead, it unveiled a facet of human consciousness that I am still grappling to comprehend, and frankly, a truth I now wish I had never uncovered. Vanderbilt's neurosurgery department is renowned for handling the most intricate cases throughout the Southeast region. We conduct over 2,000 major brain surgeries annually, addressing everything from inoperable tumors to catastrophic trauma. My personal specialization lay in cases that other surgeons deemed unmanageable, those instances where families had been informed that all hope was lost. That Tuesday morning in January commenced like any other. I had been operating since dawn, meticulously removing a meningioma from a teacher's brain. The procedure concluded flawlessly, and I was engrossed in updating patient files when the ordinary shattered. At precisely 11:47 a.m., my pager vibrated with a message that would irrevocably alter my understanding of the genuine capabilities of the human brain. The urgent message was from Dr. James Montgomery, the Chief of Emergency Medicine, and it conveyed, "Incoming trauma, ETA 8 minutes, severe head injury. Need neuroconsult immediately." Having collaborated with Dr. Montgomery for over a decade, I was well aware he was not prone to undue alarm. When he requested an immediate neurosurgical consultation, it unequivocally signaled that we were facing a case likely demanding emergency intervention to preserve a life. I hastened to Trauma Bay 3, where the emergency team was already preparing the necessary equipment. The paramedics had contacted us in advance, providing preliminary information that painted a grim picture. A male patient, approximately 35 years old, found unconscious at a construction site following a scaffolding collapse. The patient had sustained what appeared to be massive, blunt force trauma to the skull, accompanied by evidence of significant intracranial pressure and potential brain herniation. What was the mechanism of injury? I inquired of Dr. Montgomery as we awaited the ambulance. According to witnesses, he replied, a steel beam descended approximately 20 feet and struck him directly on the top of his head. The force of the impact was so severe that it drove his hard hat down past his ears. The construction crew was forced to use power tools to cut the hat from his head. The ambulance arrived at 11:55 a.m., and the paramedics wheeled in a patient who immediately struck me as being in the direst possible condition for survival. The man appeared to be in his mid-30s, with brown hair matted with blood and a skull visibly deformed from the impact. His head was swollen to nearly twice its normal size, and there was evident depression fracturing across the entire top portion of his skull. However, what first captured my attention was not the extent of his horrific injuries, but his eyes. They were wide open, astonishingly alert, and keenly tracking movement around the room with perfect clarity. Patients suffering such a severe level of head trauma are typically unconscious, unresponsive, or at best, exhibiting only minimal neurological function. This patient, however, was looking directly at me with intelligent, focused eyes that seemed entirely aware of his surroundings. "What's his Glasgow Coma Scale?" I asked the lead paramedic, Tom Wilson, whom I had collaborated with dozens of times over the years. "That's the peculiar part, Doc," he responded. "When we arrived on the scene, he was unconscious and unresponsive with a GCS of 3, but during transport, he simply awoke. He's been alert and responsive for the past 15 minutes. His current GCS is 15. A Glasgow Coma Scale of 15 signifies perfect neurological function, normal eye opening, verbal response, and motor response. For a patient with this degree of visible brain trauma, to possess a GCS of 15 was medically impossible. I commenced my neurological examination while the trauma team diligently worked to stabilize his other injuries. The patient had multiple lacerations on his scalp that were bleeding profusely. Yet it was the condition of his skull that utterly consumed my attention. I could feel the depression fractures through his scalp, areas where the bone had been crushed inward by at least 2 inches. "Can you tell me your name?" I asked, shining a penlight into his eyes to assess his pupillary responses. "David Holloway," he replied, clearly without any hesitation. His pupils were equal, round, and reactive to light, another medical impossibility given the apparent severity of his brain trauma. "Do you know where you are, David?" I continued. "I'm in a hospital. Vanderbilt, I think, based on the signage I saw when they brought me in," he answered. "Do you remember what happened to you?" I pressed on. "I was working on the Morrison building downtown. I remember hearing someone yell, 'Look out!' and then I remember waking up in the ambulance." His responses were entirely appropriate and oriented. He displayed no signs of confusion, disorientation, or cognitive impairment. I performed a comprehensive neurological assessment, testing his reflexes, coordination, and motor function. Every aspect was normal. In fact, it was better than normal. His reflexes were hyperactive, his coordination was flawless, and his muscle strength was excellent. Dr. Montgomery gazed at me with the same bewildered expression that I knew was mirrored on my own face. "Catherine," he stated, "I have never witnessed anything like this. The mechanism of injury should have resulted in immediate death, or at the very least, left him in a persistent vegetative state. How is he even conversing with us?" "I don't know," I admitted. "Let's get him to CT immediately. I need to see what is happening inside his skull." 20 minutes later, I was confronted with CT images that defied every single principle of neurosurgery I had acquired during my medical training and career. David's skull displayed massive depression fractures across the parietal and frontal bones, with bone fragments driven deeply into the brain tissue. There was significant brain swelling, multiple areas of hemorrhaging, and what appeared to be extensive damage to critical brain regions, including the motor cortex and areas responsible for speech and consciousness. According to these scans, David should have been deceased. At the very least, he should have been unconscious, paralyzed, and completely unable to speak or comprehend language. The damage I was observing was utterly incompatible with any level of neurological function, let alone the perfect cognitive performance he was currently demonstrating. "This cannot be correct," I stated to Jennifer Hayes, our head radiologist. "Run the scans again. There has to be some kind of imaging error." Jennifer proceeded to run a second CT scan, followed by an MRI for enhanced soft tissue visualization. The results were identical. The imaging unequivocally revealed devastating brain trauma that should have resulted in either immediate death or a permanent vegetative state. "Catherine, I have been interpreting brain scans for 20 years, Jennifer remarked. "I have never encountered anything like this. The damage is real. I can clearly see it on multiple imaging modalities. But somehow, this patient's brain is functioning normally, despite injuries that should have obliterated his ability to think, speak, or even breathe independently." I returned to David's bedside, clutching the impossible scan results. He was sitting upright in bed, conversing casually with one of the nurses about the Nashville Predators hockey season. Upon seeing me approach, he looked directly at me with those same alert, intelligent eyes. "Doc, the nurse mentioned you took some pictures of my brain. How bad is it?" Throughout my career, I had delivered dire neurological news to thousands of patients and their families. Yet I had never faced a situation quite like this. How does one inform a patient that they have sustained brain injuries that should have killed them when they are sitting before you engaging in a normal conversation? "David, I need to be honest with you," I began. "The scans indicate that you have sustained very serious injuries to your brain. the kind of injuries that typically lead to significant neurological problems. "But I feel fine," he interjected. "I mean, I have a headache, and I can tell my head is swollen, but I can think clearly. I can remember everything. I don't feel like I have brain damage." I consulted with Dr. William Foster, the chief of neurosurgery, regarding David's case. Dr. Foster had been practicing neurosurgery for over 30 years and possessed familiarity with some of the most unusual cases documented in medical literature. Even he was utterly perplexed by David's presentation. "The imaging is unambiguous," Dr. Foster affirmed as we reviewed the scans together. "This patient has suffered massive, life-threatening brain trauma. The bone fragments are compressing critical areas of the brain, and the swelling is generating dangerous intracranial pressure. By every medical standard, this patient requires immediate emergency surgery." "But his neurological function is perfect," I emphasized. "He's alert, oriented, speaking normally, with no motor deficits. How do we justify operating on a patient who appears to be neurologically intact?" "We justify it," he retorted, "because the imaging clearly shows that without intervention, the swelling and bone fragments will cause progressive brain damage that could result in death within hours. The fact that he is currently functioning normally does not alter the reality of his injuries." Dr. Foster was medically correct, yet something about the entire situation felt fundamentally wrong to me. We were contemplating performing emergency brain surgery on a patient who was talking, thinking, and functioning normally, based solely on scans that showed injuries utterly incompatible with his current condition. After thorough discussions with David and his family, who had gathered at the hospital, the decision was made to proceed with surgery. The considerable risks associated with foregoing the operation, brain herniation, and potential death from elevated intracranial pressure, far surpassed those linked to surgical intervention. At precisely 6:30 p.m. that evening, David was transported to operating room 7 for an emergency craniotomy intended to evacuate intracranial hematomas. Though I had successfully performed this specific type of surgery countless times throughout my career, I had never before operated on a patient who, despite presenting with the most severe brain trauma I had ever encountered, remained neurologically intact. The anesthesia team faced initial challenges with intubation as David remained alert and conversant even under sedation. Dr. Rachel Turner, our lead anesthesiologist, was compelled to administer anesthetic agents in dosages higher than normal to achieve the necessary level of unconsciousness for the procedure. "Catherine, this is highly unusual," Dr. Turner remarked while monitoring David's vital signs. "His brain scans indicate massive trauma, yet his neurological responses to anesthesia are identical to someone with an entirely healthy brain." Upon making the initial incision and reflecting the scalp, the full extent of the damage became even more horrifyingly evident. The skull fractures were severe, with numerous bone fragments driven deep into the brain tissue. As I meticulously began removing the compromised bone and debris, I could discern areas of the brain that were completely destroyed, gray matter pulverized by the impact. However, as I delved deeper into the surgical field, I started to observe something that profoundly challenged my understanding of neuroanatomy. Specifically, the brain regions that appeared utterly destroyed, both on scans and during direct visualization, were areas crucial for fundamental neurological functions. The motor cortex, which governs voluntary movement, was severely damaged. Significant portions of Broca's area, vital for speech production, were obliterated. Sections of the frontal lobe, indispensable for consciousness and personality, were reduced to mere pulverized tissue. Yet just hours prior, David had been speaking clearly, moving normally, and exhibiting flawless cognitive function. 3 hours into the surgery, while meticulously extracting bone fragments from the injury's deepest point, I encountered something unprecedented in my 18 years of neurosurgery. In an area where the brain tissue should have been entirely destroyed, I discovered what seemed to be new neural tissue, brain matter that appeared fresh, healthy, and utterly undamaged. "Jennifer, could you take a look at this?" I called out to our surgical pathologist, Dr. Jennifer Adams, who was present in the operating room to examine the tissue specimens we were excising. Dr. Adams peered into the surgical field using the operating microscope. "Catherine, what am I looking at?" she questioned. "This tissue appears completely normal. It's neither damaged nor scar tissue. It looks like healthy brain tissue." "That's impossible. This area suffered a direct impact from the steel beam. The tissue here should be utterly destroyed." I took a small biopsy of the seemingly healthy tissue and proceeded with the surgery. By 10:15 p.m., I had successfully removed all bone fragments, evacuated the blood clots, and meticulously cleaned the surgical site. Yet, the further I worked, the more I discovered areas of healthy brain tissue in locations where the trauma should have caused complete destruction. The surgery itself was technically successful. I had addressed all traumatic injuries and relieved the intracranial pressure. However, I was left grappling with unsettling questions about what I had witnessed within David's brain, questions for which I had no answers. David's recovery proved to be as astonishing as his initial presentation. Within 6 hours of surgery, he was awake, alert, and neurologically intact. Most patients undergoing this type of emergency craniotomy typically require days or even weeks to regain basic neurological function, if they ever do. "Good morning, Dr. Mills," David greeted me the following morning when I checked on him. "How did the surgery go?" "The surgery went well, David," I replied, "but I need to ask you some questions about how you're feeling." "I feel great. My headache is gone, and I don't feel confused or disoriented at all. When can I go home?" I performed a comprehensive neurological examination. David's cognitive function was impeccable. His motor skills were normal, and he exhibited no signs of the typical deficits associated with the kind of brain trauma he had sustained. Over the next 3 days, I ordered every available neurological test. EEGs displayed entirely normal brainwave patterns. Cognitive assessments revealed no impairment in memory, reasoning, or executive function. Motor function tests were also normal. It was as if David had never suffered a brain injury whatsoever. 5 days after the surgery, Dr. Adams contacted me regarding the pathology results of the tissue specimens removed from David's brain. "Catherine, I need to discuss these results with you in person. Can you come to my office, Doctor?" Adams had served as our surgical pathologist for over 15 years, and never before had I heard her sound so perplexed or uncertain about pathology findings. When I arrived at her office, an array of microscope slides and test results were spread across her desk. "I've run every test I can conceive of on these tissue samples," she stated. "The damaged brain tissue exhibits precisely what we would anticipate from severe blunt force trauma: cellular destruction, hemorrhage, and necrosis. However, the healthy tissue samples are unusual." "Unusual how?" "The cellular structure is consistent with normal brain tissue, but there are characteristics I've never observed before. The neural connections appear more complex than typical brain tissue, with increased dendritic branching and synaptic density. It's as if this tissue is more advanced or evolved than normal human brain tissue." "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not entirely sure what I'm suggesting, Catherine. I'm simply conveying what I'm observing under the microscope. This tissue doesn't appear to have originated from the same brain as the damaged tissue." Dr. Adams then showed me the microscope slides. The damaged tissue perfectly matched what I would expect from severe brain trauma. However, the healthy tissue displayed a neural architecture that was more intricate and organized than anything I had ever witnessed in normal brain specimens. "Have you ever seen anything like this before?" I inquired. "Never. I've even sent samples to colleagues at other institutions for confirmation, but no one has been able to definitively explain what we're looking at." David was discharged from the hospital 5 days post-surgery, completely free of neurological deficits and without any restrictions on his activities. I scheduled him for regular follow-up appointments to monitor his recovery and watch for any delayed complications from his brain injury. At his 2-week follow-up appointment, David seemed entirely normal. His surgical incision was healing well, and he reported no symptoms or problems. Yet, during our conversation, I began to perceive a subtle change that hadn't been apparent during his hospitalization. "How has your recovery been at home?" I asked. "It's been interesting, Dr. Mills. I feel completely normal, but there are some things that seem different. Different how? I seem to grasp things more quickly than I used to. At work, I can solve complex problems that previously took me hours to figure out. I can recall conversations and details with perfect clarity. It's as if my brain is operating better than it did before the accident. This was neurologically concerning. Patients who suffer severe brain trauma typically experience some degree of cognitive impairment. Even if their recovery is good, they do not usually report improved cognitive function. Can you give me a specific example? I pressed. Last week, I was working on a structural engineering problem involving intricate calculations for load distribution. Before the accident, that kind of problem would have consumed most of my day, requiring numerous references and calculations. But now, I can instantly visualize the solution, almost as if I can perceive the stress patterns and load paths in my mind. David was a construction supervisor, not a structural engineer. The type of analysis he was describing demanded advanced engineering training and years of experience. Over the subsequent weeks, I conducted extensive research into cases similar to David's. I scoured medical literature for reports of patients who had recovered from severe brain trauma with enhanced rather than impaired cognitive function. What I found was a mere handful of such cases scattered across decades of medical literature, yet none offered a clear explanation for what I had personally witnessed. I also began a more thorough investigation into David's background. According to his medical records and employment history, he was a high school graduate who had worked in construction for 15 years. He possessed no formal training in engineering, mathematics, or any field that could account for his newly acquired analytical abilities. However, as I delved deeper, I uncovered inconsistencies in his background that raised profound questions about the true identity of David Holloway. His employment records at the construction company only extended back 2 years, despite his claim of 15 years in construction. His Social Security number had only been active for the past 3 years. Most significantly, there was no record of his existence prior to 2020. I contacted Detective Lisa Morgan at the Nashville Metro Police Department, with whom I had collaborated on previous cases involving patients with suspicious backgrounds. Detective Morgan, I have a patient who was injured in a construction accident, but I'm uncovering some irregularities in his background that I believe you might want to investigate. What kind of irregularities, Dr. Mills? There's no documentation of his existence prior to 3 years ago. No school records, no previous employment history, no family records. It's as if he simply materialized in Nashville in 2020 with a completely fabricated identity. Although Detective Morgan agreed to delve into David's past, her investigation only deepened the enigma surrounding him. 3 weeks following David's operation, Detective Morgan reached out to me, sharing insights that irrevocably altered my comprehension of the entire affair. Dr. Mills, I urgently need to discuss your patient, David Holloway, with you. Could you possibly come to the police station this afternoon? Upon my arrival at Detective Morgan's office, I found her desk covered with an open file brimming with documents and photographs. David Holloway simply doesn't exist, she stated, without pleasantries. His Social Security number pertains to a David Holloway who passed away in 1987 at the age of 6. The employment records are fabricated, and the address he provided doesn't match his actual residence. Then who exactly is he? I questioned. We haven't determined that yet, she replied. But we've processed his fingerprints and DNA through national databases, and we're not finding any matches. It's as though he has no criminal record, no military service, and no official documentation anywhere within the United States. Detective Morgan then displayed photographs of David's genuine dwelling, which turned out to be a modest apartment filled with sophisticated scientific apparatus, medical textbooks, and research materials implying a breadth of knowledge far exceeding that of a construction worker. Dr. Mills, there's something more, she continued. We discovered evidence in his apartment suggesting he might have been conducting some form of medical or scientific research. There are intricate anatomical diagrams, neurosurgical texts, and what appear to be experimental notes concerning brain function and neural regeneration. The implications were truly astonishing. The man I had performed surgery on, whom I had presumed to be a construction worker experiencing a miraculous recovery, seemed to possess extensive expertise in neuroscience and brain function. "Has he committed any crimes?" I inquired. "None that we can ascertain," she responded. "However, Dr. Mills, I believe you need to consider the possibility that your patient is not who he claims to be, and that his recovery was not as miraculous as it seemed." I promptly scheduled an urgent appointment with David for the following day, ostensibly for a routine post-surgical follow-up. When he entered my office, I observed that he carried himself with a self-assurance and awareness that differed significantly from the construction worker I had initially encountered.
"David, I need to ask you some direct questions concerning your background and your recovery."
"Of course, Dr. Mills. What would you like to know?" he replied calmly. "I want to know your true identity. The police investigation has revealed that David Holloway is not your real name. Your background has been entirely fabricated, and your apartment contains scientific materials that indicate knowledge far beyond what you've professed to possess." David gazed at me for an extended moment, and I noticed a shift in his expression. It wasn't surprise or defensiveness. It was the look of someone who had anticipated this very conversation. "Dr. Mills, how would you react if I told you that everything you believe about brain function, neural regeneration, and the confines of human consciousness is fundamentally inaccurate?" "I'd say that sounds like a fascinating theory," I retorted. "But it doesn't answer my question about who you are." "My name is Dr. Alexander Vaughan," he finally revealed. "I hold a doctorate in neuroscience from Johns Hopkins University, with specialized research in neural regeneration and consciousness transfer. I work for a research institute that explores advanced neuroscience applications not yet recognized by mainstream medicine." "What kind of research institute?" I pressed. "The kind that investigates the possibilities of enhancing human brain function, regenerating damaged neural tissue, and expanding the limits of human consciousness beyond what current medical science deems possible." Over the ensuing 2 hours, Alexander, if that truly was his name, unveiled a narrative that challenged every preconceived notion I held about neuroscience and the boundaries of medical possibility.
According to his account, he was employed by a private research institute, funded by technology companies and government agencies, dedicated to exploring methods for augmenting human cognitive function and repairing brain damage through techniques far exceeding present medical capabilities. "We've developed methods for stimulating neural regeneration that can mend brain damage in real time," he explained. "We've also learned how to enhance existing neural pathways to boost cognitive function far beyond normal human limits." "That's scientifically impossible," I interjected. "Neural tissue in the adult brain does not regenerate to the extent you're describing, not with current medical techniques." "No," he conceded, "but we've discovered novel methods of neural stimulation and cellular regeneration that can restore damaged brain tissue and even elevate function beyond normal human parameters." Alexander described his own case as a testing ground for an experimental neural regeneration protocol. The construction accident had been genuine, and the brain damage I had observed on the scans was authentic. However, during the surgery, he had undergone an experimental treatment that triggered rapid neural regeneration in the afflicted areas. "The tissue you discovered during surgery," he continued, "the healthy neural tissue in regions where there should have been complete destruction, that was regenerated tissue. Brain matter that had been obliterated by the trauma and subsequently regrown using advanced stimulation techniques." "And you voluntarily underwent this experimental treatment?" I asked, astonished. "I did," he confirmed, "but the treatment had unforeseen effects. The regenerated neural tissue isn't just restored to normal function, it's enhanced beyond typical human cognitive capacity." Alexander proceeded to explain that the neural regeneration process had resulted in brain tissue that was more advanced than standard human neural architecture. The increased dendritic branching and synaptic density that Dr. Adams had observed in the pathology samples were not anomalous. They were the intended outcome of the experimental treatment. The regenerated tissue facilitates processing speeds, memory capacity, and analytical abilities that considerably surpass normal human limits.
What you perceived as cognitive improvements in me was not a side effect of brain trauma, it was the consequence of an enhanced neural architecture. And the research institute you claim to work for, I pressed, they're engaging in unauthorized human experimentation? Not unauthorized, he corrected. I willingly volunteered to be a test subject for this experimental treatment. However, the institute operates outside conventional medical oversight because the techniques we are developing are decades ahead of what mainstream medicine is equipped to accept. Alexander then outlined a comprehensive research program focused on enhancing human cognitive abilities through advanced neuroscience techniques.
According to his claims, they devised methods for repairing brain damage and improving function that would revolutionize neurosurgery and neurology if embraced by the medical community. Dr. Mills, he proposed, what if I told you that the limitations you accept for brain function, the notion that severe neural damage is permanent, that cognitive ability is fixed, that consciousness is confined to normal human parameters, what if all of that is simply incorrect? I want to illustrate something for you, Alexander declared, pulling out a tablet computer. These are problems requiring advanced mathematical analysis and spatial reasoning that should be impossible for someone without extensive training in engineering and mathematics. He then presented me with a series of intricate structural engineering problems involving load calculations, stress analysis, and three-dimensional modeling. These were challenges that would typically demand specialized software and hours of computation by expert engineers. Alexander solved each problem in his head within minutes, offering detailed explanations of his reasoning and arriving at solutions that I later confirmed were correct. He demonstrated an astonishing ability to visualize complex three-dimensional structures, compute stress distributions across multiple load paths, and optimize designs for maximum efficiency. Before the neural regeneration treatment, I couldn't have solved these problems, he admitted. My background is in neuroscience research, not structural engineering, but the enhanced neural tissue enables me to process and analyze complex information in ways that normal human cognition cannot achieve. You're suggesting that this experimental treatment bestowed upon you superhuman analytical abilities? I asked, still struggling to process the implications. I'm telling you that it granted me access to cognitive capabilities that reside within the potential range of human brain function, but which are typically restricted by the constraints of natural neural architecture. Alexander continued to describe a research program that was investigating not only neural regeneration, but also the fundamental enhancement of human cognitive abilities. According to him, the Institute had developed treatments that could boost memory, accelerate processing speed, and expand analytical capabilities far beyond normal human limits. We're exploring ways to unlock the full potential of human consciousness, he emphasized. The human brain possesses an enormous capacity that remains untapped due to limitations in neural architecture and synaptic connections. Our treatments can effectively remove those limitations. And how many individuals have undergone these experimental treatments? I inquired. Over the past 5 years, approximately 50 volunteers have participated in various phases of the research program, he responded. The results have been consistently positive, showing significant enhancements in cognitive function and no adverse effects. What about medical oversight and ethics approval for this research? I pressed, sensing a critical point. Alexander fell silent for several minutes, and I could discern that this was a question that genuinely troubled him. Dr. Mills, he eventually began. Mills, imagine discovering methods capable of eliminating brain damage, significantly boosting human intelligence, and expanding consciousness beyond current comprehension. Yet you're aware it would take decades for the medical establishment to endorse such groundbreaking treatments. I would adhere strictly to proper research protocols and ethics approval processes regardless of the time required, I stated. Even if that meant millions enduring brain injuries and cognitive limitations that could easily be addressed with readily available techniques. The discussion had shifted from a medical enigma to a profound ethical debate. Alexander was detailing research that, if authentic, promised to revolutionize treatments for brain injuries, cognitive disorders, and the augmentation of human mental capacities. However,
He was also describing research conducted without conventional medical oversight or ethical approval. Alexander, even if your claims are true, conducting human experimentation without appropriate oversight and approval is hazardous and unethical. There's no way to guarantee patient safety or assess long-term effects. I appreciate your concerns, and from the perspective of traditional medical ethics, your point is valid, he responded. But consider this. Every major stride in medical science has required researchers to transcend the accepted boundaries of their era. That doesn't legitimize unauthorized human experimentation, I retorted. No, it doesn't, he conceded, but it also doesn't justify allowing treatable conditions to persist due to bureaucratic processes that can delay new treatments for decades. Alexander recounted instances where experimental neural enhancement treatments had successfully restored cognitive function in patients suffering from traumatic brain injuries, degenerative diseases, and developmental disorders. According to him, conditions previously deemed permanently disabling could be effectively treated with techniques far surpassing current medical capabilities. Dr. Mills, what if I could present you with brain scans from other patients who have undergone these treatments? Individuals with severe traumatic brain injuries who've achieved complete recovery, Alzheimer's patients whose cognitive function has been fully restored, people with developmental disabilities who now function at genius levels. Alexander then displayed files on a tablet computer containing brain scans, test results, and case reports from dozens of patients purportedly treated with various experimental neural enhancement therapies. The documentation appeared genuine and thorough, illustrating dramatic improvements in brain function and cognitive ability through before and after comparisons. These patients had conditions considered incurable by current medical science, he explained. Severe brain trauma, degenerative diseases, genetic disorders affecting cognitive function. Yet after treatment with neural regeneration and enhancement protocols, their brain function was either restored to normal or enhanced beyond normal parameters. The cases he presented were astonishing, assuming their authenticity. Patients with severe Alzheimer's disease showing complete restitution of memory and cognitive function. Individuals with traumatic brain injuries exhibiting heightened analytical capabilities. And people with developmental disabilities scoring at genius levels on cognitive assessments. How do I know these cases are real and not fabricated? I inquired. You don't, without independent verification, he admitted. But Dr. Mills, you've witnessed my case firsthand. You operated on my brain. You observed the extent of the damage, and you've seen my recovery and enhanced cognitive function. That isn't fabricated. That's something you can confirm through your own experience and medical records. He was correct. Regardless of any other deceptions Alexander might be perpetrating, I had personally witnessed his improbable recovery from brain trauma that should have been fatal or resulted in permanent disability. Alexander, what do you expect from me? I asked. I need your assistance in documenting and understanding what transpired during my treatment, he replied. I want to approach this systematically and scientifically, and I require a neurosurgeon who can help evaluate whether the treatments we are developing are genuinely effective or if we are merely deceiving ourselves about the results. And what about the ethical dilemmas of unauthorized human experimentation? I pressed. I aim to work towards bringing this research into compliance with standard medical ethics and oversight, he stated. But I also wish to continue developing treatments that could aid millions of people currently considered beyond medical help. Over the subsequent weeks, I immersed myself in investigating Alexander's claims and attempting to corroborate the information he provided. What I uncovered was profoundly unsettling from both a medical and ethical perspective. The case reports and brain scans he had shown me, when reviewed by colleagues at other institutions, appeared authentic. The neural enhancement effects he described were consistent with advanced research in neuroscience and neural regeneration being conducted at prominent universities and research centers. Most significantly, I managed to verify several of the patient cases he presented by directly contacting the individuals. They confirmed their medical histories and the remarkable improvements in cognitive function they had experienced after undergoing experimental treatments. However, as I delved deeper, I also unearthed troubling aspects of the research program Alexander had outlined. The experimental treatments were being conducted in clandestine facilities, devoid of oversight from medical institutions or regulatory agencies.
Patients were recruited through private networks rather than standard clinical trial procedures, and there was no long-term follow-up to assess the safety and efficacy of the treatments. Most alarming was the discovery that several patients who had undergone experimental neural enhancement treatments had experienced severe psychiatric side effects months or even years after their procedures. Enhanced cognitive abilities had been accompanied by personality changes, emotional instability, and in some instances, complete psychological breakdowns. Alexander, I've found cases where patients who underwent your experimental treatments developed serious psychiatric problems after their initial recovery. I am aware of those cases, Dr. Mills, he conceded. The neural enhancement treatments can have psychological effects that we are still working to comprehend and manage. And you didn't consider this important information to share with me earlier? I challenged. I wanted you to evaluate the effectiveness of the treatments based on the medical evidence, not be swayed by complications that affect a small percentage of patients. A small percentage? I countered. I've found documentation of psychiatric side effects in over 30% of the patients who underwent neural enhancement procedures. Alexander remained silent for several minutes. When he finally spoke, his tone lacked the confidence he had displayed throughout our previous conversations. Dr. Mills, we are working with techniques that push the boundaries of what human consciousness can tolerate. Enhanced cognitive abilities come with risks that we are still learning to manage. Alexander, I need to know the truth about who you truly are and the nature of the research you're actually conducting. He met my gaze with those same intelligent eyes that had perplexed me since the day he arrived in the emergency room. But now, an additional element was present in his expression. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear. The truth is that I am not fully aware of the extent of what we are dealing with, he admitted. The neural enhancement treatments are effective, but they transform people in ways we did not foresee. Enhanced cognitive function brings with it psychological changes that can be profound. What kind of psychological changes? I pressed. Patients begin to think and perceive reality differently, he explained. Their enhanced brains process information in ways that normal human consciousness cannot handle. They start to discern patterns and connections that others cannot perceive. They develop insights into the nature of reality that can be psychologically destabilizing. Are you telling me that the treatment you underwent is affecting your psychological stability? Alexander did not answer directly, but I could perceive a shift in his expression. The confidence and clarity that had characterized his demeanor since the surgery were being supplanted by something resembling confusion or uncertainty. Dr. Mills, what if I told you that I'm not entirely certain what's real anymore, he confessed. The enhanced cognitive abilities allow me to process information and observe patterns that normal human consciousness cannot access. But that level of awareness comes with the realization that much of what we consider reality is constrained by the limitations of normal human perception. Over the subsequent weeks, I continued to monitor Alexander's psychological state as well as his neurological recovery. What I observed was deeply concerning from a psychiatric perspective. His enhanced cognitive abilities continued to develop, enabling him to solve increasingly intricate problems and exhibit analytical capacities far exceeding normal human limits. However, these capabilities were accompanied by psychological changes that grew more pronounced over time. Alexander began describing experiences suggestive of an altered perception of reality. He claimed to be able to predict future events, to grasp complex systems through intuition rather than analysis, and to discern patterns in human behavior and natural phenomena that were imperceptible to others. Dr. Mills, the enhanced neural tissue doesn't merely improve analytical thinking, he asserted. It fundamentally alters how consciousness itself functions. I can perceive information and patterns that normal human awareness cannot access. Alexander, what you're recounting sounds like you're exhibiting symptoms that could indicate psychological instability or even psychosis. That was my initial thought. However,
what if my experiences aren't about psychological dysfunction, but rather an expanded awareness that normal human consciousness simply cannot grasp? This very line of reasoning was precisely what troubled me most. Patients afflicted with psychiatric disorders frequently interpret their symptoms as heightened capabilities or unique insights, rather than recognizing them as indicators of mental illness. As weeks progressed, Alexander's condition continued to transform in ways that were both medically intriguing and psychologically unsettling. His cognitive abilities ascended to levels that appeared impossible for the human brain, yet his adherence to conventional reality grew increasingly fragile. He began articulating perceptions of multiple dimensions of reality simultaneously, claiming to understand the fundamental essence of consciousness and to access information existing beyond normal space-time constraints. These assertions were accompanied by mathematical proofs and scientific explanations of such advanced complexity that I couldn't assess their validity. Dr. Mills. The Research Institute has been monitoring my progress, and they believe the neural enhancement has succeeded beyond their expectations. But they also acknowledge that the psychological effects are more complex than they anticipated. Alexander, I'm concerned that you may be experiencing a psychological break from reality. The symptoms you're describing are consistent with certain types of psychotic disorders. I understand why you would think that, but consider this. If someone's consciousness genuinely expanded beyond normal human limits, wouldn't their experiences necessarily appear to be symptoms of mental illness to observers with normal awareness? This was a captivating question that delved into the core of how we differentiate between enhanced perception and psychological dysfunction. Indeed, if an individual's consciousness was genuinely operating at a higher level than normal human awareness, their experiences would undoubtedly seem like delusions or hallucinations to those with conventional perception. 3 months following Alexander's surgery, I was contacted by an individual claiming to represent the research institute he had described. Dr. Victoria Lauren telephoned my office and requested a meeting to discuss Alexander's case and the experimental treatments he had undergone. Dr. Mills, we understand that you've been working with one of our research subjects and would like to discuss the medical and ethical implications of the treatments he received. Dr. Lauren met me at my office the subsequent day. She appeared to be in her 50s, possessing the demeanor and credentials of a legitimate medical researcher. She claimed to hold a doctorate in neuroscience from MIT and to be the director of research at an entity known as the Advanced Consciousness Institute. Dr. Mills, Alexander volunteered to undergo experimental neural regeneration and enhancement procedures as part of a research program investigating the limits of human cognitive potential. What he experienced during his recovery from brain trauma was the result of cutting-edge techniques that are decades ahead of current medical capabilities. Dr. Lauren, if what you're telling me is true, why is this research being conducted outside normal medical oversight and ethics approval processes? Because the techniques we've developed challenge fundamental assumptions about brain function and human consciousness. The medical establishment isn't prepared to accept research that suggests human cognitive abilities can be enhanced far beyond what's currently considered possible. Dr. Lauren presented me with documentation of research programs being conducted at private facilities across the country, investigating neural enhancement, consciousness expansion, and cognitive augmentation through advanced neuroscience techniques. According to Dr. Lauren, Alexander's case was part of a broader research program that had been exploring human consciousness enhancement for over a decade. The research was financed by technology companies and government agencies interested in developing methods to augment human cognitive abilities for scientific, military, and commercial applications. We've developed techniques that can not only repair brain damage, but enhance cognitive function far beyond normal human limits, she stated. The neural regeneration you witnessed in Alexander's case is just one application of these methods. And how many people have been subjected to these experimental procedures? Over the past 10 years, several hundred volunteers have participated in various phases of our research. The results have been consistently positive in terms of cognitive enhancement, but we've also encountered psychological effects that we're still working to understand. Dr. Lauren conceded that the neural enhancement treatments could induce psychological changes that were challenging for patients to manage. Enhanced consciousness brought forth perceptual abilities that could prove overwhelming or destabilizing for individuals unprepared for such dramatic shifts in awareness. Alexander is experiencing expanded consciousness that allows him to perceive aspects of reality that are normally beyond human awareness. From his perspective, he has gained incredible insights into the nature of consciousness and reality. From the perspective of normal human psychology, his experiences appear to be symptoms of mental illness. Dr. Lauren, what you're describing is unauthorized human experimentation that violates every principle of medical ethics and research safety. These procedures are being conducted without proper oversight, informed consent, or long-term safety monitoring. Dr. Mills, we understand your concerns about research ethics, but consider the implications of what we've discovered. We have techniques that can eliminate brain damage, cure cognitive disorders, and enhance human intelligence beyond anything previously possible. Should we abandon this research because of bureaucratic concerns about approval processes? Yes, if it means protecting patients from experimental procedures that haven't been properly tested for safety and effectiveness. But what about the patients who could be helped right now with treatments that exist but aren't approved? What about people with traumatic brain injuries, degenerative diseases, and cognitive disorders who could be cured with techniques that are available today? It was the identical ethical argument Alexander had put forth, that the potential benefits of the research justified conducting it outside normal medical oversight. Yet I had witnessed the psychological effects of the treatments firsthand, and I knew that the risks were substantial. Dr. Lauren, Alexander is experiencing psychological symptoms that suggest the neural enhancement treatments may be causing serious mental health problems. How can you justify continuing this research when you know it can result in psychiatric complications? The psychological effects are a necessary consequence of expanded consciousness. When human awareness is enhanced beyond normal limits, individuals necessarily experience reality in ways that can be difficult to integrate with conventional psychological frameworks. After months of investigating Alexander's case and the research program he had described, I arrived at a conclusion that fundamentally altered my approach to neurosurgery and medical practice. The neural enhancement treatments were real, and they were effective at boosting cognitive function beyond normal human limits. However, they came with psychological costs that made them dangerous and potentially harmful to patients who underwent them. Alexander's enhanced cognitive abilities continued to develop, but his psychological stability consistently deteriorated. He began experiencing episodes of confusion, disorientation, and what appeared to be a complete detachment from reality. The enhanced consciousness that had initially seemed advantageous was transforming into a form of psychological imprisonment. Most unsettling was the realization that Alexander couldn't revert to normal consciousness even if he wished to. The neural enhancement was permanent, and the psychological effects were progressive and irreversible. I endeavored to continue monitoring Alexander's condition and working with the Research Institute to comprehend the long-term effects of neural enhancement treatments. However, I found myself increasingly unable to function as a neurosurgeon when I knew that techniques existed that could revolutionize brain surgery, but that came with unacceptable risks to patients' psychological well-being. 6 months after Alexander's surgery, I submitted my resignation from Vanderbilt University Medical Center. In my resignation letter, I cited personal reasons for leaving, but the truth was that his case had profoundly undermined my confidence in the ethical boundaries of medical research and treatment. I relocated to a small practice in rural Tennessee, where I work as a general physician, addressing routine medical problems and avoiding cases that necessitate advanced neurological intervention. I deliberately selected a practice that wouldn't expose me to the ethical dilemmas and impossible medical situations that had characterized my experience with Alexander. Yet, I still contemplate his case every single day. I wonder what became of him after I ceased monitoring his condition. I wonder how many other patients are undergoing experimental neural enhancement treatments at private research facilities. And I wonder if the medical community will ever be prepared to acknowledge that techniques exist for augmenting human consciousness, even if they arrive with psychological risks that we are not equipped to manage. I often ponder the unsettling notion Alexander presented, that an expanded consciousness, when viewed by those with conventional awareness, might inherently manifest as a mental illness. Should his conjecture hold true, then our entire understanding of the bounds of human cognitive capacity and the definition of psychological well-being could be rooted in the confines of our own restricted perception.
For me, the ordeal of Alexander Vaughan will forever stand as the most enigmatic and unsettling episode throughout my tenure as a neurosurgeon. It profoundly illustrated that the demarcation separating a medical marvel from a psychological calamity might be far less substantial than we commonly perceive, and that the human cerebrum harbors latent capabilities we are only just beginning to grasp, capabilities we might not yet be equipped to unleash responsibly. While I now find more restful sleep practicing in a rural setting, I am still troubled by the scores of patients purportedly undergoing neural enhancement procedures at research institutions throughout the nation. This unease stems from the possibility that somewhere individuals may be existing with an augmented consciousness that grants them the ability to apprehend reality in manners incomprehensible to typical human awareness.
And I remain uncertain if any of us are truly prepared for the profound implications this holds regarding the essence of human consciousness and the ultimate limitations of medical intervention. The brain upon which I performed surgery that January in 2023 continues to disturb my thoughts, not because of what I discovered, but because of the potential it unveiled, possibilities that we may lack the sagacity to judiciously pursue.